Across the Caribbean, a change is taking place.
These days now are getting much warmer than they used to be.
I have seen a big change, a reasonably big change, over, my lifetime. And the island is much greener now than it used to be 30 years ago.
We started out the village to the next end, there was sand. There were trees and the catching of fish was a long time better.
Some say these are the beginning effects of climate change. What is climate change? Is it really happening? Why? What can we do about it? I'm Ramon Dodson. In the half hour ahead, why we in the Caribbean should be concerned about climate change and why we need to heed the call. Let's all adapt. Before we can understand how the climate is changing, we need to understand what it is.
Climate is more or less a look at the average weather. It's also looking at long-term state of the atmosphere. Unlike weather, we tend to use the slogan here at CIMH that weather is what you get and climate is what you expect. So what you expect is what you're accustomed to having on average or as a normal. But weather can change from day to day. It could be different one time of the year in 1 year, and at that same time of the year in another year it could be absolutely different.
Very little in the world is absolutely constant. The climate certainly is not.
Climate variability tends to discuss the changes on a shorter term. We would expect normally that rainfall is expected to be a certain amount in the wet period, a certain amount in the dry period. But essentially we know that from year to year we had dry seasons that were wet and we had wet seasons that were drier than normal. So that's variability, because you can average it, but there's a range, there are ranges of experiences we have around that average. The trends it suggests here, for example, what has been happening over the last few decades. In the trends, we are definitely seeing an increase in the temperature. Statistically significant increases, should I say.
With respect to rainfall, however, there is difficulty identifying a trend connected with greenhouse gas emissions by man, referred to sometimes as anthropogenic climate change.
It doesn't mean that it wouldn't eventually happen. What we are saying at this time, that a lot of the rainfall decline trends across the Caribbean, we have not yet witnessed statistically. But we do want to understand that once one thing in the atmosphere changes, temperature for example, that we are seeing the current trends, eventually we would expect other things will change. Maybe certain responses lag others in time, but with time we would see some changes in the other aspects of climate. We are expecting that by the end of the century we'll be a few degrees Celsius warmer in the Caribbean, and maybe anywhere from 20-25 to 50% drier in certain parts of the Caribbean.
The reason we are seeing what we call climate change, which is global warming, is as a result of the way we have used fossil fuel since the Industrial Revolution. We feel that there's an accumulation of certain types of gases in the atmosphere that basically shields the radiation on its way out from the Earth after the Earth is warmed by the sun, and more or less acts as a greenhouse, traps that heat, causing global temperatures to rise.
What then are the weather-related hazards that climate change will affect?
Hazards such as rainfall, heavy rainfall, and that can be associated with extreme weather events such as hurricanes, and if we have hurricanes we also would have very strong winds. Sometimes these extreme rainfall events can cause flooding, which can also cause landslides, and that can also cause mud flows. We also note that a Amongst the hazards that climate change will bring will be things like drought.
In addition, the rise in global temperatures we're experiencing are causing the level of the sea to rise.
We've been losing our beaches through erosion, and the coastline has been receding at an alarming rate.
As the climate changes, so too does our weather, environment, and the land on which we live. What we are observing now is just the start, and scientists are predicting much more is yet to come. The impact that climate change can have on our lives depends on many things. It can depend on what we do for a living, where we live, the structural integrity of our homes, our vulnerability.
Inherently, as small developing countries, we are already vulnerable. The social scientists will tell you that we have small economies. Some of our countries depended on one export product, bananas in some, sugar in some. We are heavily dependent on tourism, and the tourism plant depends a lot on our natural environment. Most of our development, as you see in the region, is coastal, or roads, or airports, or hospitals. We live close to the coast. Now, one of the problems with global warming is the sea that surrounds us. And the projection is that we are going to have a sea level rise. That sea level rise will inundate some of our low-lying coastal infrastructure, and particularly when we get storms, which translates into a storm surge, a lot of our buildings, a lot of our roads, a lot of our airports are basically exposed to the hazard. There are other issues, of course, with warmer seawater. We are seeing our coral reefs, a critical resource for the Caribbean, undergoing bleaching, which will have impacts on our fisheries. There are several physical changes that are going to impact on us negatively. But most of all, we are poor. And poverty basically prevents us from putting in place the sort of things that would protect us from some of these impacts.
Davin Vanterpool is the owner of the Whistling Pines restaurant in Anegada, Virgin Islands. He recounts the changes that have taken place along the shoreline of his establishment.
As the climate change, you find it's started, the sand and things start to erode and go out. And then when hurricane all came, it make it a lot more problem, cut away all the sand from the beach and thing, So I used to have a line of trees, run from this tree right up on the edge. Where I used to, the tourists like to come sit down and dine and enjoy them dinner, but now it's no more.
But in some places in the Caribbean, sea level rise without the added effect of storm surge is wreaking havoc.
The erosion there has been happening at an alarming rate, to the extent that we have to do beach renourishment ever so often. That's one of the areas where it is designated as our touristic area. And tourists come to the island for the sun and the sea and the sand.
The rise in level is but only one of the concerns when it comes to the sea. The temperature of the water may also have a dramatic impact on marine food supplies.
Some work that some researchers have done in the region started to look at what will happen to our fish, your mahi for instance, the grouper, the snapper, when the ocean temperatures start to rise. And it's distressing. What we see is like our populations, there's a migration into the cooler waters of the north. So that means you're taking away the livelihoods of those coastal communities.
Our wildlife is also being affected. The islands of Montserrat and Dominica have seen mountain chicken populations almost wiped out because of a fungus that has come to the fore as temperatures have increased.
This particular issue really was one very close to the heart of Dominicans, because you're well aware that mountain chicken is our national dish and it's part of our heritage. And so when we first noticed a lot of our frogs were dying, we find them dead, it was a huge concern. So that's a classic case, really, of how climate change can impact on our local culture, heritage, wildlife, and so on.
Effects on our societies could even reach as far as impacts on cultural events.
Titiri is a very cultural type of fish that we have been enjoying for many, many years. And we developed this festival to improve on the image of the Titiri and to show the impact, social impact and cultural impact on our citizens. And this said had to be cancelled totally because of the again negative impact of the mature dam bursting its banks and all the sedimentation and sand and other effects of this dam bursting its banks.
While the failure of this dam cannot be attributed directly to climate change, the effects could be similar had it been. Also of concern are heat-related illnesses which could take a toll, especially on children and seniors. And there's the question of our coastal communities which may have to face relocation.
It's hard to ask somebody who lived there all their life to relocate to a new area. I mean, the sentimental values that they have for that area goes beyond deeper than what we could ever understand. So in most instances we try to educate them to take preventative measures in terms of their development so that it minimize or reduce the impacts of storm surge or sea level rise.
These are merely a few examples of how climate change can impact our societies. The reality is that in some manner, everyone on Earth will be affected somehow by climate change.
Most of the disasters that we've had to deal with so far as a region have been weather related. And that is due to the natural climate variability that we have lived with for years. And this translates into hurricanes, it translates into floods, it translates into landslides when we get heavy showers. And of course, we don't get a disaster unless that hazard basically impacts on a vulnerable area. Climate change, what we are saying about climate change is that, look, these hazards that you're already experiencing in a warmer world, in a world that we are projecting for the future, these hazards are going to become much stronger. Disaster risk reduction in the Caribbean has been geared to dealing with those weather-related, climate variability-related hazards. And how do you manage disasters? You manage disasters in such a way that you increase the resilience of your community, of your infrastructure, of your country, basically before the event. So this speaks to proactive action. Of course, reactive action even after the event. But the new paradigm is that the more resilient your community is, the more resilient your country is, the less damage an event will cause. And hence recovery basically will not cost that much. Now this is what climate change adaptation is about. Increasing resilience.
Climate change adaptation, however, should not be confused with another term that you may hear from time to time, which is climate change mitigation.
In climate change language, we call mitigation the getting at that root cause of climate change, taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, putting less greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
In the Caribbean, we are responsible for less than 1% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. While we should try to cut down on that small figure, our future will be more secure if we concentrate on adaptation.
We're talking about the ability of a community to be able to bounce back after they have been impacted, and they're therefore able to resist or absorb the particular impact that they've had. And a lot of that is really built on them being able to understand the risk that they face and being able to put in place measures based on their own abilities and their own resources to be able to address that particular hazard. And therefore, that's why you have the whole issue of coping capacity, because your coping capacity allows you to use your skills and your resources to face these adverse conditions.
So, in a nutshell, being resilient and better able to cope helps us to reduce the level of an impact by a hazard like those affected by climate change, hurricanes, flooding events, and drought.
The connection between climate change and disaster reduction is certainly very strong. And if we look at the history of what's been occurring within the Caribbean region within the last 2 decades or so, for instance, between 1980 and 2007, nearly 98% of the disasters that we had, 99% of the casualties, and 99% of the economic losses were related to natural hazards. And these were caused by meteorological, hydrological, and climate-related events, such as cyclones and storm surges and floods and extreme temperatures. All these hazards that are climate related.
Preparing for these hazards is something that everyone should be doing sooner rather than later. Hazards never go away. Therefore, we should be always trying to minimize our risk to disasters.
Disaster risk reduction is definitely something that everyone needs to be involved in, because the decisions that you make as an individual can serve to protect you, your family, and your community. And therefore, the efforts of the government can only really yield results if we as individuals get involved. And hence, therefore, when we look at simple things as protecting our homes, if we're looking at simple things as it relates to hurricane resistance, putting hurricane straps on our homes, if we're looking at flood resistance in terms of how we elevate our homes, these are things that we can do as individuals, and these are things that we can do together as communities, so everyone must definitely be involved.
So simple building codes, putting up shutters. These are simple activities that you can do to minimize the effects of climate change and also be doing risk reduction activities. We're talking now about sea level rise compounded with storm surge in the event of how we have, let's say, hurricanes. Simply building a safe distance away from the shores. I know we're in the Caribbean and we love to be at the coastline, we love to see the sea, but the sea is a creature which we need to respect, and it can cause a lot of havoc in certain cases. So we can just minimize that by building a bit further from the coast, or not build along the coast to begin with.
There are actions you can take as a community to adapt to climate change.
It starts by awareness. You have to be aware of your community. You have to be aware of what hazards you are exposed to, and that takes an effort on behalf of the community to ensure that they'll look at the situation collectively. So for instance, you may have a group already in your community. You may meet together, for instance, because of crime, and you may have what they call a neighborhood watch. You may have it may be a sporting arrangement that you may have. The community may like cricket, or they may like football, or they may come together for a social activity, maybe a domino club or church or some other meeting. But this can be an opportunity for you to discuss the hazards that the community may face. Do you think that the community may very well be prone, based on where it's located, to storm surge? Do you think that it may be prone to inundation by a river? Do you think that there are things that are happening in the community, such as the inadequate or indiscriminate disposal of waste that can block drains and can therefore exacerbate flooding as well? So these are times for you. These are times and there are opportunities for you to discuss what are those hazards that the community face. So it starts by awareness, and then it certainly looks at having an action plan of what you're going to do as a community, individually and as a community, to be able to be resilient to these impacts.
But none of this will be possible without a community group focused on the task.
Within the context of the community group that you may have, whether it's an existing community group or whether you want to form a new structure, you would want to have core members of a team of people who will be responsible for pulling together the elements of the plan. However, it is important that everyone within the community is involved to some extent in the plan. And when I say everyone, you may not get every single person being involved in the development, but they certainly need to have an understanding of what the plan says and what you will do as a community. And this can be a very simple thing. It can be a community barbecue event. If you have a map of your community, you have a good start. And you can get a map of your community from maybe your lands and survey department. You can get it from talking to maybe your disaster office, but that will give you an idea of the physical, geographic location of your community and where there are certain things, what are the particular hazards that might very well be affecting that area based on locations, based on the actual development or evolution of the community. So you'll protect your buildings, you protect your people, you protect your livelihoods. And those are the three elements that your plan should seek how to protect.
If climate change takes away the beach allowing waves to destroy your house, there are measures that you can take to protect your property. In Anegada, one property owner was faced with this dilemma and turned to giant sandbags to hold back the water. Placed before Hurricane Earl struck in 2010, the bags withstood the storm surge of the hurricane. St. Kitts is dealing with the erosion along parts of its coastal highway with rock revetments. Communities in the Caribbean that may be facing water shortages could learn a good lesson from St. Lucia's Jeff IWCAM project that teaches how to harvest rainwater for domestic use. This has also been happening in Anguilla for some time.
We harvest our own water, we store our water in systems. So if government water was to go off, we still would have some way of accessing water. We don't use our groundwater supply at present, and most of the farmers use that water for irrigation purposes.
But farmers need to think beyond irrigation.
We know, our farmers know, to some extent, that things like use of windbreaks, certain practices, cultivation on slopes beyond a certain degree of steepness is not advisable. The crops you grow, the use of things like grass barriers, the importance of drains, storm drains and drainage of your farm, the importance of the structure, the way your farm buildings are constructed. The selection of sites for certain enterprises, not to, for example, to establish livestock housing in areas that you know that would prone to flooding. So there are a number of things that we are aware that can be done.
To assist farmers in future planning for crop planting, crop varieties and irrigation, the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology is now issuing seasonal forecasts available on their website. These forecasts won't be able to tell you what the weather will be like on a specific day, but it will let you know if a period of a few months will be wetter or drier than normal. All of this is in the interest of ensuring our food supply, as are the adaptive measures fishermen are taking in Dominica.
15, 20 years ago, most of our fishery, 60% of our fishery was from reef fishery, inshore reef fishery. Now, 60% or more of Dominica's production is from offshore fishery, large pelagics, and from FADs. So we were able to shift our fishery from inshore to offshore and thereby continue the necessary food security.
Similar in principle to the century-old Georgetown seawall in Guyana, Barbados has built a boardwalk that is multifunctional and aesthetically pleasing. Also in Barbados and in neighboring Tobago, sea oat and sea grape have been planted to stop beach erosion. From an educational point of view, youth are carrying the message about disaster preparedness across Grenada, where there is an annual comprehensive disaster management champions competition organized by the National Disaster Management Agency. Some groups are rolling up their sleeves and getting to work, like the Island Harbor and Eastern community groups in Anguilla.
They are actually heavily involved in cleaning of debris, debris from within the roads, roadside cleanup, derelict vehicles, vegetation management, cleaning of culverts, and they're doing other things like ensuring that we be able to suppress small fires, light search and rescue. They also do things like first aid within schools and within the community, and taking care of the elderly for evacuation purposes and things like that.
The residents of Rose Hill, Grenada decided that their task should be to train as many community members as possible in disaster management. Jill Knoll and Joy Fleming are two of the facilitators.
In this community, we have a lot of children, we have a lot of people. Even though you don't see them, we have a lot. So we need to educate ourselves and also the people on what to expect in terms of disaster and when they come in a shelter.
We dealt with different types of radios, the frequency, the types of antennas and so on. They could easily erect an antenna and also install the radio for themselves and go ahead and start communication to wherever affected area they could cover.
Rose Hill is a country community many miles from Grenada's capital, St. George's. It has one access road. The way in is also the way out. Should an emergency occur, all of the training received by the residents makes them more resilient and far better able to cope than they were before the training. With all of these positive projects and more happening in the region, it showcases that there is something each of us can do to reduce the impacts that climate change can have on our economy, our way of living, and our progress as a developing society. Pay attention to the things brought out in this Voices for Climate Change song from Jamaica. Preparing our communities for the hazards associated with climate change is something we all need to be involved in. If we prepare to reduce the risk posed by hazards such as hurricanes and drought, we're preparing for the effects of climate change. The important thing is to take action, and now.
If we don't get our responses right, we can have some serious catastrophic consequences down the road. However, if we put our mechanisms in place to enhance our coping capacity, we need not to fear, but we can make the best out of whatever conditions lies ahead in the future based on climate change.
The records are bearing out the fact that climate change is happening, and there is no reason to think that it will stop anytime soon. Since we can't stop it, we're going to have to adapt to it. It's the only answer.